Being vandalized across our province. The first instance came last week when a Calgary Edgemont Alberta Party candidate sign was defaced with racial slurs. Over the weekend, a vulgar message the Prime Minister was spray painted over NDP signs in Red Deer. But perhaps most disturbing, Edmonton residents woke up Wednesday to half a dozen NDP signs covered with crude language and swastikas. That last symbol is a particular concern to our next guest. Barbara Perry is the director at the Centre on Hate, Bias and Extremism at the University of Ontario Institute of Technology. Barbara, first off, were you at all surprised to see a swastika on a campaign sign in Alberta? Are we seeing a rise in the use of this symbol?
Well, I think we're seeing a rise of it generally, vandalism and graffiti on public buildings and other kinds of signs. But I think this is a really targeted attack when you start to see them appearing on political signs, and especially for the NDP. I think that's a powerful message about, what the members of the far right group or those who are sympathetic to them think about the NDP and their policies. I think perceiving them as the traditional left party, and perhaps complicit in what they see as key problems around immigration, multiculturalism, those sorts of issues. So I think it is quite worrying.
I want to dig a little deeper into the message that this is sending. Typically, this symbol, the swastika, is associated with anti-Semitism and white supremacy. But what is it being used to represent today? Who is this hate being targeted at?
Well, I think it's being used as a general symbol of hatred, not just restricted to anti-Semitism any longer. It is generally used, I think, to show hatred, hostility, and distrust of a whole array of communities, and I think in this case, politicians and political parties as well. So it is used by the right in a number of ways. It's become sort of a generic symbol for the others and those who are responsible for dramatic demographic changes in the country in particular.
Mm-hmm. And I understand in 2015 you published a study examining the far right movement generally in Canada. Broadly, what did that study find?
Well, in that study, we found that it was quite widespread, with, I think, concentration in particular in Ontario, Quebec, southern Alberta, and a little bit in BC. And so we found that there were just over 100 active groups. But I think that was a very conservative estimate even then, because we really were restricting ourselves to those 4 areas and to urban areas in particular. I think the disturbing trend that we're seeing now is a dramatic increase. We had been estimating, over the last couple of years, maybe a 25 to 30% increase. But then when we started to name the groups and to create our lists of the groups, it's far higher than that. It's well over 200. I think we're closing in on 300 active groups spread across the country, east to west and north to south. And again, in urban areas, but also in remote rural areas as well.
And I want to look at the landscape, I guess, of the far right. How are they using social media? What is their online presence like? And are they using that presence to, I guess, garner more support?
Sure, the online is really where a lot of them live. So, for example, Limit, which was a group formed in Quebec in 2015, very, very quickly identified 40,000 active members online or members online. How many of them are active, in rallies and that sort of thing is hard to say, but it's certainly not 40,000. So, I think that's a real indicator of how expansive the use of the internet is, and multiple forums. Many of these groups have websites. Many of them have, at least now, that may change quite soon, have Facebook, very active Facebook presence, and other kinds of platforms. YouTube, we see a lot of music videos in particular on YouTube, but also videos of their rallies and that sort of thing. So most of the social media venues are used quite broadly, and they create domains of their own, like Gab and 4chan, that sort of thing, when they can't find traction on other sites. And so again, it allows them to congregate as groups, as individual groups, but also to engage and connect with people in other parts of the country and other parts of the world as well. It really is an international movement, and the internet has really facilitated that, what we've been sort of referring to as the construction of a global identity.
Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned, social platforms are responding to these groups in different ways. Facebook announced new measures just this week. But I guess in terms of a more local response, how prepared are law enforcement to deal with these groups and the potential risk they may pose?
Yeah, it's really variable. Depends on the community. And, when we were doing the work in 2013, 2014, there were a lot of communities where, law enforcement were, one said, for example, well, we know they're here, but until something happens, we're not going to worry about it, which is not a very satisfactory response. Others sort of denied the fact that there was a presence, that there were active groups in their communities, media representations to the contrary. I think I will say when we were in Alberta, that Calgary and Edmonton in particular, and the Alberta Hate Crime Committee that's very active there, were very much aware of the activity there, and at that time were very good in terms of sort of knocking on the door and saying, we know you're here, and sort of trying to deter their activity in that way by letting them know that they were being observed. So I got to say, at that point in time, I think that they were law enforcement in those two municipalities in particular were taking it quite seriously.
Yeah, and looking towards some of those solutions, I know tackling this from a provincial level, in recent months, Alberta has appointed an anti-racism advisory council, and as you just mentioned, they announced the creation of a provincial hate crimes unit. But do these efforts go far enough in countering right-wing extremist initiatives, or what needs to happen?
Well, I mean, it's a multi-pronged approach that we need to take, and multiple sectors need to be involved. We need to include our education facilities, all the way from elementary to university. Kids need to be immunized, if you will, against the potential for recruitment. Some of my students a couple of years ago developed a workshop on the far right and delivered it to a number of high school classes. And the youth had no idea that it was a thing and what to watch for. So I think that education is really important. Public education is really important as well in terms of awareness. The social media industry needs to, take very action, I think, as Facebook is beginning to do with its announcements yesterday. And of course, political leaders and in particular party leaders need to be steadfast in resisting the creep, if you will, of adherents of the far right into their campaigns. And I think that that's something we saw, outside the party apparatus in municipal elections here in Ontario last time around. You're certainly seeing it there in Alberta. And, I fear that we're going to see a lot of this. I think we'll see some sort of ugly politics coming up, leading up to the federal election.
Yes, and we will certainly be watching for that and see the provincial and federal leaders' response. I wish we had more time, but we will have to leave it there. Thank you so much for this.
I appreciate you paying attention.
That is Barbara Perry. She's the director at the Centre on Hate, Bias and Extremism at the University of Ontario's Institute of Technology. And straight ahead, our